Welcome to In Defense of the Revolution, a Cuba Solidarity podcast from a Canadian perspective. My name is Cam Scott, and I'm joined by Isaac Saney, and we are here today, April 9th, to talk about the situation facing Cuba, the ever-changing, tightening, but also in some ways perhaps slackening fuel blockade that the U.S. has enacted, among many other features of this emergency. Right now, it looks as if a Russian tanker has successfully breached the total blockade of the island that was announced by Trump in late January. And this would be the first formal delivery of fuel. I think that perhaps some 30,000 barrels were strategically allocated the private sector, according to a February report. But otherwise, no fuel has reached the island since January. So this is terribly significant. What are you reading and hearing about this?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly significant. And I think it's, in a sense, a part and parcel of the tremendous international solidarity and support diplomatically that Cuba has received when Trump announced the escalation, for many of us, the incredibly unexpected escalation of the economic war against Cuba, threatening to tariff any country's goods that came into the United States if they exported or sold or gave or shipped oil to Cuba. And so this had a tremendous impact, and not a drop of oil entered Cuba for over 3 months, and creating all sorts of crises, as many of the listeners might well know. In terms of trying to paralyze the country, impacting, transport, so people couldn't get to their work, couldn't get to the hospitals, food couldn't get from the farms, and also, in a sense, the long, deeply frustrating, right? Blackouts or power outages that existed in Cuba, what the Cubans call apagones. So all of this thing was to completely starve Cuba, and it was seen as perhaps the final blow, right? Now, the Cubans responded with a tremendous amount of resilience, as we've always expected. They've gone through something similar before. This might be the greatest economic crisis they've faced, and I think it is the greatest crisis they've faced, not simply economically, because of what's happened in terms of the access to resources, but the extreme hyper-aggressive of the United States. But during the collapse of the Soviet Union, where they lost 85% of their trade and so forth, access to markets and a whole number of different things, and thus to oil, they went through a similar situation of a lack of fuel and so on. And so the Cubans responded with a tremendous amount of resilience, creativity, ingenuity. One of the things we can perhaps talk about is how Cuba has amplified its move to renewable energy sources in terms of actually to provide what's necessary for the country, particularly around solar. And so the question of fuel coming into Cuba became central, right? Because, as any Caribbean island, most of them, perhaps except for Trinidad and Tobago, depend on oil imports to survive. And most countries that will depend on oil imports to survive. It's essential. It's the most strategic commodity we can actually argue in the entire world. And the goal was basically to paralyze Cuba, as we saw. And of course, people were hoping, and there's all this outpouring of statements of support, of solidarity, and people kept on saying, well, what other countries, particularly countries of the BRICS, rise to Cuba's defense by actually sending not just humanitarian aid, and there's been lots of humanitarian aid, Mexico, which used to provide Cuba with oil and so forth, and was in fact, Cuba's perhaps second most important source of oil other than Venezuela. And then of course we had the intervention in Venezuela in January 3rd, that it basically, and even up to that, the U.S. had been slowly strangling Venezuela's oil supply to Cuba. So even Mexico, and with Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, who had made very powerful statements about Cuba, they stopped shipping to Cuba. And so the question was Cuba going to be starved to death, and specifically completely paralyzed and brought to a stop? And of course, all of us was demanding, and there's, that countries send oil, and people were sending petitions and so forth. And then within that, just a few weeks ago, the Russian government made a statement which was very interesting, and I had a very interesting conversation with people. It said, Russia was prepared to provide all the support that Cuba needed. It didn't say, Russia was prepared to provide support. They used the word all. I remember having a conversation in private with somebody. I said, I think we can think that implies oil. And then they announced that basically speaking, there was going to be this tanker that was going to arrive in Cuba. We know there were previous tankers that was supposed to arrive in Cuba from Russia. There was one carrying diesel. There were a whole number of others, right? Okay, that was seemed to be heading to Cuba, and many of us who were follow Cuba very closely were diligently following the tracking of the ship, and then it turned back, right? And so because of the the U.S. threats of seizing the tanker, perhaps of the imposition of tariffs. But then the Russians made it very, very, very clear that this tanker, the Anatoly Kropotkin, if I think that's how it's pronounced, right, was definitely going to arrive in Cuba with 100 tons of oil. And some reports say that it was actually escorted, if not by a Russian frigate, by a submarine, right? And some people are even talking, some of the reports, that there were negotiations between the United States and United States, I'm sorry, and Moscow, right, Washington and Moscow, about the allowing this shipment of oil into Cuba. And so the ship has arrived, it's dispatched its oil. There's another one that's been prepared and perhaps even on its way now to Cuba with another shipment of much needed oil. And I think it's important to understand that the shift, I think, in allowing Russia to penetrate this blockade of Cuba, this fuel blockade, is driven by two things. One, the international outcry and the condemnation of it by many people, okay, particularly not just the U.S. determination to starve Cuba, but the glee that Trump was taking in, and Rubio, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, the glee that they enjoyed, they were taking, they were basically expressing about the impact it was having on Cuba, right? From the hospitals to the paralyzation of life. Trump saying that Cuba was going to be next on his list after Iran, the threats of invasion, and all that sort of stuff. There was an international outcry. And of course, we cannot separate this space that has been opened from Cuba from the debacle, the defeat. The United States has faced a strategic defeat in the Persian Gulf as it wages its criminal and illegal war on Cuba. So I think all of these things played into opening up this particular space. But I think above all, it was the resilience of the Cuban people, the resilience of the Cuban Revolution, the creativity and the tenacity of the Cuban leadership, right, in rallying their people and trying to muster what limited resources they have, okay, to meet these challenges, right? And so I think that has shocked the U.S. ruling class, and particularly shall we say, that section that's coalesced around Donald Trump, who believe what they say, believe their propaganda, believe their malign representations of Cuba and so forth, believe the idea that Cuba is a failed state. Cuba is not a failed state, it's a besieged state. And if there's ever a failed state, it's the United States, the richest country in the world, that's unable to provide for its citizens, and yet wages relentless criminal aggressions across the world. And so they believe their own propaganda, and Cuba has shown themselves to be extremely resilient and to have defied once again these prophets of doom. And I also think as well, they know that Cuba will be a different nut to crack. So when we think of what happened in Venezuela, and one of the shall we say, the challenges, right? And one of the caveats, okay, and perhaps disadvantages of talking about these current events that are unfolding is that it's many years down the road. Once documents are released, once interviews are done with people who are participating in this stuff, that we tend to get a more complete and perhaps, if I use the word, truer picture of how things unfolded. So on January 3rd, when they went into the attack and that aggression against Venezuela and seized President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, okay, and kidnapped them and took them off into the dungeons of the United States. The U.S. portrayed it as a surgical assault that went on without a hitch, where there were no casualties. But now we increasingly know that the 32 Cubans who died along with the other compatriots, even though they were caught by surprise and were fighting with what would be considered technologically inferior weapons compared to what the United States had, that whole array of hundreds of troops with their most advanced weaponry, that they fought extremely well. In fact, they were fought like lions, and even some of the United States authorities have acknowledged this, demonstrating that Cuba would be a much more difficult nut. There'd be tremendous resistance. And Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel just gave an extensive interview with Newsweek. And he made the point that if the United States were to attack Cuba, not only would there be extreme casualties on both sides, but the Cubans would wage a guerrilla struggle. And we know that U.S. imperialism is extremely sensitive to casualties and so forth. So I think what we're witnessing two things is one, the inherent resilience and power of the Cuban Revolution, the rallying of the Cuban people behind the struggle to preserve the project of national independence and social justice, and of course this project of revolutionary internationalism, which Cuba has always espoused, symbolized, and epitomized, but also the context of the geopolitical situation in which U.S. imperialism made a tremendous gamble, a gambit as we would say in chess, okay, to try and, in a sense, establish and cement its domination of the Persian Gulf as part of cementing its global hegemony in the world, as part of perhaps of, in a sense, directly constraining what it sees as its main rival, which is China, but more importantly, to put off the arrival of a multipolar world, okay, which means sort of like the twilight of U.S. imperialism as the global hegemon. That all of that has played into a role of opening up this space, right, in terms of challenging and breaching this fuel blockade. And I should make also point as well is that the International Flotilla of Solidarity played a very important role as well in demonstrating the fact that we have solidarity from governments, okay, in the global south, and of course those not aligned with U.S. imperialism, but we also have a burgeoning support from the ground up, the masses of people. In the United States, for example, and I might make this as my one or two of my last points, the polls clearly indicate that that the people of the United States are opposed to any kind of aggression against Cuba, oppose this fuel blockade, this attempt to starve the Cuban people into submission, and in the sections of the U.S. ruling class, there are divisions, and we see there's actually going to be there's actually been an introduction of a bill under the War Powers Act in the United States to ensure that Trump cannot unilaterally launch any aggression against Cuba unless he gets congressional approval. So it's amazing that when he announced this in January, this fuel blockade and these tariffs, right, with business, this attempt to starve Cuba, this increasing in ways we didn't anticipate of this economic war against Cuba, things looked very different at that moment, right? But one of the things that has characterized perhaps the last 5 years or so of global politics, or global geopolitics, is things can change very, very quickly. So the Cuban people have demonstrated ingenuity, creativity, and resilience, and geopolitics is witnessing some very significant tectonic changes and so forth. So the struggle still continues. The U.S. is still trying to starve Cuba. The economic architecture of what the U.S. calls U.S. embargo, what people refer to, what the Cubans call the blockade, and what Fidel Castro said is in reality an economic war, is still in place. Cuba faces challenges, but they are continuing to defend their independence and demonstrate, the fact that the Cuban people will defend the space, which is what Cuba is, of human dignity, of social justice, of an alternative to this very rabid world we live in.
That's a fantastic summary of this very fluid, dizzying situation. And my interest catches on something you said here regarding the irony of the present situation, in which the U.S. finds itself so susceptible to what is in essence a fuel blockade by Iran amid the U.S.-Israeli escalations. So the restriction of flows through the Strait of Hormuz by Iran, this is limiting 20 million barrels a day or some enormous number, 20% of global supply, has meant that the U.S. has opened its strategic reserves and has even had to ease sanctions on Russian and Iranian oil. Now, amid this ceasefire that's already been breached multiple times over, it looks as if Iran is poised to further entrench its logistical and strategic advantage over the strait. And this outcome of a U.S.-initiated sequence may well ease pressure on Cuba, among other unanticipated outcomes. So I also agree that one outcome that the U.S. desired was the weakening of China, which is a major oil importer and relies upon this strait as well as anybody, and that now it looks as if the major U.S. allies on the strait are potentially shut out of the 10-point plan that Iran has proposed to negotiators. And it looks as if the U.S. has overplayed its hand and in some respects shown itself to be that fabled paper tiger. But then there's that Khrushchev chestnut where he says that the paper tiger has nuclear teeth.
And I mean, and that's the point. People often use the term. The actual quote is actually taken from Mao Zedong, right, where he describes U.S. imperialism as a paper tiger. But that's not the complete quote. He says both U.S. imperialism is a paper tiger and a real tiger at the same time, right? Because obviously it has extracted a tremendous cost in Venezuela and in Iran, right? And through its proxy, we can argue the relationship between the United States and Israel. People have the different positions, but the tremendous loss, not just in infrastructure and billions of dollars worth in damage, but above all in the cost of human life, right? So even as it's an empire in decline, and therefore, in a sense, is a paper tiger, right? Some people would argue that there are limits to what it can do. And I think what he was talking about, and Kissinger actually once spoke about this. He spoke about the fact that one of his frustrations, right? And one of the things about that is as much as a war criminal as he was an extremely intelligent person, right? But he was in service of imperialism. And one of the things he noted in one of his memoirs was the limits of U.S. power, that the U.S. could not control and could not dictate everything. Right? And of course, that happened in Vietnam. It happened in some other places where the U.S. imperial policy had setbacks. And so, in this sense, right? That's a paper tiger because it's not invincible. Okay, it can be beaten. It's in decline, right? The empire is declining, but at the same time, it's a real tiger. It has this immense military power, and now it's clear that there's significant sections of the U.S. ruling class who, in order to preserve or to offset the delay, right, or to deny reality about its decline, are willing to commit genocide, right, to wipe out entire peoples. And so, as much as people like to focus on the individual of Donald J. Trump, right, and his psychopathy and his malignant narcissism, right? No, he is, a psychopath who's come to power in a psychopathic system, right? He is a consequence, a symptom, and a catalyst, right? And people often talk about the law of unintended consequences, right? Well, these guys launched this war, okay, and there's these laws of unintended consequences, which you so clearly pointed out. They launch it to entrench their control and to cement their control, and the result has boomeranged in their face. And I think it's important to understand. So, and there's a lot of prognosticators, all these sages who are talking about this. I don't want to say we can predict the future, right? But part and parcel of the Monroe Doctrine, which was this amplification of the Monroe Doctrine, which was articulated in 1823 about the Americas being sort of almost the exclusive sphere of influence of the United States. But it was sort of covered in the fig leaf that they were going to stop any other European imperial powers from intervening. But really, it was explicitly saying, we will control the Americas. And the Monroe Doctrine, in perhaps the most perused U.S. national security strategy, which is the one of 2025, talked about the United States having complete hegemony in Latin America, in the Americas, right? Even up to the point of choosing who was going to be in power. They say it explicitly. I mean, in the past, they used to hide it under things. This is for freedom. This is for democracy. This is for human dignity and so forth. But all the actions obviously were to the opposite of that, and their motives were different, right? But the Monroe Doctrine was about cementing the control, and many people saw that simply as Fortress America. There was going to be America first. Well, what it was about them securing the Americas, their first zone of influence, right? In order to push out all kind of what they would see competing interests, right? In order to prepare themselves as this base for the drive for world hegemony. But it's important to understand that this began with Obama. Obama had the so-called pivot to Asia, right? And then Blinken, the Secretary of State under Biden, spoke about Latin America as being the front line of struggle against China, right? And so there's a tremendous amount of Chinese investment in Latin America, right? And so part and parcel of the Monroe Doctrine was, of course, expelling China from Latin America, cementing further U.S. control in its so-called own backyard. That's a pejorative term and disrespectful term they use for the rest of the Americas, right? But also part of that was therefore squelching any examples of independence in Latin America and the Caribbean. And when you come to that, Cuba is the clear example, right? For over, 65 years, 67 years, Cuba has resisted the United States. It ended its existence as a neo-colony, truly established Cuban independence, right? And was the unforgivable revolution that had to be crushed as well. And so when they launched the attack on Venezuela, it was part of the people always articulated that the road to Havana runs through Caracas, right? And the destruction of Cuba was seen as incredibly important, right? In terms of not only bringing Latin America completely under the thrall and control of the United States and crushing any ideas of independence, but it was also a geopolitical move as well, because if they were able to do this with Cuba, it would strengthen their hand across the world globally. And what we have seen, okay, is that in response to this, Cuba, itself at one point was embattled and surrounded, right, and facing this dire circumstance, right, okay, has, as I said in previously, has demonstrated its tremendous resilience. And then, as you point out, when the U.S. gambled, right, launched on this attack on Iran, this criminal, illegal, immoral war, right? They believe their propaganda, and of course we've seen a weakened U.S. power. Now some people may argue that the Trump regime may seek to have a quick victory to sort of assuage and cover up their defeat in Iran by perhaps trying to launch some sort of aggression against Cuba. But I think that's less likely. But you never know. I mean, it's completely unpredictable, as you pointed out. It's dizzyingly unpredictable, dizzyingly fluid, right? Okay. But I think, now that the U.S. has been weakened, right, it has strengthened Cuba's hand. And I think an important point we must talk about as well is the incredible role of Cuba's diplomatic corps, right? Their ability when facing what many countries would have surrendered and collapsed under, right? Okay. Their diplomatic corps was involved in a incredibly brilliant meetings and so forth, and campaign, right, meeting with leaders, meeting across the world and so forth. And Cuba was not isolated, right? And now I think Cuba's hand has been strengthened in many ways, right? So, and when we look at Iran as well, I think it's important to understand, when you mentioned the ceasefire that's been broken, I mean, the Iranians made it very clear, okay, that this ceasefire is not just simply about Iran, it's about Lebanon, right? It's about this ethnic cleansing and brutal campaign that Israel is waging in Lebanon, right? And that was part of the ceasefire. And the Iranians have made it very clear that, basically speaking, they're not going to abandon Lebanon and so forth. So, I think, it's increasingly important that us in the Cuba Solidarity movement not only focus on Cuba, right? Okay, and, the struggle Cuba is in, right? Okay, but also understand that we're in a very different epoch in that sense, right? That Cuba is now part of these tectonic shifts that are taking place in geopolitics and so on.
I mean, that's also well observed, and I think the role of Cuba as an articulator and its internationalist cultures and its more authentic diplomacy in this sequence shouldn't be underrated either, because we don't want to make it sound, not that, I don't think anyone would get this impression from the way we're speaking, but from the way that the mainstream media covers it, it's not that Cuba is being tossed about on a stormy sea of great power intrigue. Cuba is definitely, I think, a very vital part of this rearticulation of the world, and this is one of the reasons why the Cuban processes, diplomatic and internal, are such a threat to the United States, in spite of the obviously slanderous insinuations that Cuba is in any sense a state sponsor of terrorism and so on. This isn't to say that Cuba has anything but peaceful and diplomatic intentions toward the world, and even the United States, amidst all of Trump's bluster about making a deal. It's been repeated many, many times over by the Cubans that it's the United States that has never come to the table, And
Yeah,
I,
and I think that's an
yeah,
important point. I just want to make a point about Cuba's. So Cuba's diplomatic work, which is commendable, is rooted in the framework of international law, fundamental principles of international law
yes,
embodied in the United Nations Charter, the right of sovereignty, the right of self-determination, right? Okay, complete opposition to the use of force in settling international disputes and conflicts and tensions in the world, right? They've been the most articulate voice, right, when it comes to these things, right? I mean, they're the most one of the most powerful and eloquent voices defending the Palestinian people, okay, in terms of defending their right to exist and so on. So they've always worked in that incredible framework, right, of international, these fundamental principles, right, that are essential to creating a world of peace and human dignity, right, a world of that is just, and so they've played that very important role. But I think another important point, and you've alluded to this, right? Okay, the Cubans have always been willing to negotiate with the United States. I mean, Fidel Castro spoke about this many times. He said, "Listen, we're willing to sit down with the United States and talk about all these issues, but as equals, right? Okay, but our sovereignty, our independence, our right to choose, our political, economic, and social arrangements are the right of the Cuban people and not of some external power." And there have been periodic times when Cuba's actually sat down and had these negotiations with the United States. And of course, they were the negotiations that led to what people refer to as the Obama thaw, right? Which I think, and I just want to go off here on a little tangent, if maybe the Obama thaw is extremely important, okay? Because even though the Obama administration maintained the same goals of undermining the Cuban Revolution, but doing it in what they thought was a much more clever and subtle way, okay? That 2-year thaw that existed with the lessening of some of the aspects of the U.S. economic war, even though the economic war continued, the Cuban economy, basically, in many ways flourished, right? Okay, and I always like to say, when people who want to argue that the principal cause of Cuba's economic problems, and that's not to say, and the Cubans themselves were talking about the bureaucracy, the inefficiencies in the economy, and so on. They've spoken about that themselves. But the principal cause, the primary cause of Cuba's economic problems, has always been the U.S. economic war waged against it, the U.S. economic sanctions, and so forth. And I always like to point out that 2-year period under when Obama lessened it. Okay, look at the impact on the Cuban economy, and the Cuban government and the Cuban state remained the same. The revolution was still intact, and I think that's a very powerful case study, very revealing about demonstrating sort of empirically who really is the cause of Cuba's economic problems. It's the United States as well. But I want to get back to this point that you're alluding to, like this idea of deals, and there was all this stuff in the press that the U.S. is negotiating with these people and these particular individuals in Cuba, and it was the attempt to actually portray that there were divisions within Cuba, and that the United States is negotiating with this clique and with that clique. What has always marked the Cuban Revolution and why it's been incredibly successful, okay, in being able to resist imperial pressure is the preservation of unity among the revolutionary leadership, unity within the government, and unity within the society, right? And in fact, what has happened is the escalation of U.S. pressure has deepened this unity among the Cuban people. The ideas that Miguel Diaz-Canel would have to be removed as president and so forth, all of this, right, have demonstrated to be completely pipe dreams, right? The Cubans have made it very clear that while they're willing to sit down with the United States, and you made the point, the United States doesn't want to come to the table. It only wants to come to the table as a dictator, right? They dictate terms. The Cubans have always said that their internal situation is not up for negotiation. Their right for self-determination and sovereignty. And this has been a fundamental principle that has governed Cuba's diplomacy and governed the Cuban Revolution, particularly in its relationship with the United States. I mean, there's been these things that have been going around that, Cuba's willing to offer the United States compensation. They've always been willing to offer the United States compensation for the properties that were nationalized. But what people need to know historically is that when the Cuban Revolution, the Cuban government nationalized foreign property in the early 60s, right? They came to agreements with countries of Spain, France, and Britain, etc., on agreements, because under international law, any sovereign government is allowed to nationalize any property within its national boundaries, right? Mm-hmm. As long as it gives fair compensation. And so Cuba worked out agreements with these other foreign countries. It offered United States companies compensation, right? And it was going to be based on, as they said, we're going to base this compensation on U.S. tax returns, right? Okay, the tax returns that these U.S. corporations had submitted to the Cuban government. But those are done under the Batista dictatorship, right? And those were always known to be fraudulent, right? And so the United States says they basically would not accept that because these corporations knew they were fraudulent and so forth. So the Cubans always been willing, and they had offered compensation at the beginning of the revolution. So it's always been the United States imperial power that has been an obstacle to these negotiations and so forth. But Cuba has preserved its unity in the face of this incredible pressure. It's the Cuban people have rallied behind the defense of their sovereignty and their independence. They've rallied behind the government. They know the United States is the source, the principal source of their economic problems. And more importantly, Cuba is also embarked, right, on a deepening of popular participation, right, a devolving of power, in a sense, to the municipal level of governments and so forth. So they can have greater decision-making power. They can solve these problems. So and at various periodic moments in Cuban history, quite numerous of them, when the Cubans have faced a serious crisis, right? There's always been this mass consultation, this mass popular participation in setting the direction of the country. One of the principal aims of the U.S. economic war is not only to strangle Cuba economically and to create hardship and desperation on the island, it's also in many ways to make governance on the island that much more impossible, right? And so forth, to challenge Cuba's system of popular participation in decision making and so forth. And the Cubans, in the face of this new crisis, have responded, right, at all levels, right, in trying to meet this crisis. And one of the things we haven't talked about, for example, is when the fuel blockade was imposed. They began to put in measures to ensure that hospitals, clinics, and the most vulnerable people, okay, would be provided with solar power, right, so that they could meet their demands, their needs, and so forth, right. And Cuba has now been embarked on a very significant introduction of solar power into generating electricity for individual homes, for hospitals and other facilities, but also trying to integrate this into the national power grid and so forth. And in this case, it has to be pointed out, China has provided significant assistance to them as well, and so on. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on. I think there are countries that are rising to Cuba's cause, but above all, it's the Cuban people, right, and their revolutionary leadership and structures, right, that are ensuring that the Cuban Revolution is able to meet and survive what are really tremendously difficult circumstances and so forth.
Yeah. And I think that you've touched on so many facets of that Cuban innovation and the deep democratic culture. But there's something that I want to return to as regards the false reporting of a leadership succession. When I was in Havana last week, Miguel Diaz-Canel spoke very strongly of the continuity of the revolution and its leadership. And just the other day in his interview with NBC News, he was asked if he would be willing to step down to save the country. And he replied beautifully that stepping down is not part of our vocabulary. So the U.S. media mocks at this show of strength as if it were the death flails of an outgoing government. It's a difficult situation, but I agree with your characterization of this as psyops, because not only is there a strong sense of the continuity of the revolution, but even where the continuity of leadership is concerned, there are a couple of things I want to point out that wouldn't have become part of the mainstream commentary here, which is, after all, purposed at changing the Cuban system. But I want to remark upon the democratic renewal that Cuba has embarked upon under tremendous duress, but also how socialist democracy is working, as well as the party itself. One can read U.S. comment about Fraga, the Minister of Foreign Trade and Investment, succeeding Diaz-Canel, or you can read of Diaz-Canel being forced to stand down within the year and so on. There have been many such stories. But as regards the consistency and the protocols of the Cuban system, I want to simply state that the 9th Congress of the party has been delayed because of the present emergency. And, in light of this alone, it just doesn't make sense that within a year Diaz-Canel will be replaced by someone who's neither on the Central Committee nor the Politburo. And this level of speculation is perhaps inappropriate where the sovereign processes of the Cuban government are concerned. But any part-way engaged observer of the Cuban process knows that this is a far-fetched, confabulatory account of how things might go down. And that's more so my point. And furthermore, the Constitution of 2019, which again deepens the devolution of powers onto municipalities and other things that you've mentioned already, very interesting read. But the Constitution also states that the President of the Republic may serve for no more than 2 consecutive periods. Now, I wouldn't mind if that were to change owing to the present crisis, but that's not for me to say either way. But if this is the case, then there's already serious thought being paid to succession with an eye to the continuity that Diaz-Canel incessantly invokes. So the likelihood of the outcomes that we can read in Cuban-American expat right-wing outlets that are embarked upon these lurid counterfactual fantasies of a restructuring, it's just next to zero. And I think that people also, with respect to these domestic processes, don't understand the Cuban strength of vision. When you speak of the Obama thought, yes, the U.S. absolutely saw this as an exercise of soft power, and they thought that political liberalization would follow from economic liberalization. But the Cuban government was so savvy about this. They knew what the U.S. intended and thought, we can work with this. This will give us oxygen. So right now, especially, we hear concerns from the left about the new economic model developed again under tremendous duress. And I would remind people that on paper, the special period in the 90s, which again was also a period of great innovation, looks like a textbook liberalization. In this period, we see greater foreign direct investment and more small private farms on state land and all kinds of opportunities for private business of a small scale, or with at least a 51% stake by the Cuban government itself, which is one of the reasons also why the media can falsely portray even the tourist industry as part of the military apparatus, and I digress. But this period of reform was equally a period of collective resolve and consultation that effectively directed those foreign resources. And likewise, today one might see a language in the new economic model about fostering a macroeconomic environment that favors increased external income, right? That's the phrase. The goal being to diversify these sources of external income. If you're not an attentive observer of the Cuban experiment, perhaps you raise an eyebrow, but that excessive paranoia of these developments squares very badly with the brutal daily reality of life under blockade as well. This in large part is what we're calling for when we call for an end to the blockade, among many other things, but this isn't so new. There's a lot of experience with these relationships and their management, in Cuba.
People don't realize, though, like, there have been private farmers in Cuba since the first agrarian reform in 1959, right? That's what granted land to peasants, right? And so there's an association of private national farmers in Cuba called ANAP, right? So these are people who were given access to the land, and Cuba then tried to create these cooperatives and state farms, but they were done voluntarily and so forth. And so we've got maybe 250,000 private farmers in Cuba who emerged as part and parcel of that land reform, right? And then in the 1990s, what Cuba did was they distributed land in usufruct. So people weren't actually, the land wasn't sold, but they were allowed
Yeah, it's like 20-year terms and so on, right?
20-year terms and so forth, right? But what's important here, whether it's private or not, what's important is what happens to the surplus in the society, right? Like, for example, when Cuba began to have these, private entities and so forth, small private entities, and you could hire people to work in there. People say, oh my God, there's no exploitation of human being by human being. This can't be socialism, right? The question is, though, what happens to the surplus in a society? How is it distributed? And the Cuban state takes that surplus as much as it can and to distribute it to support the healthcare, the universal healthcare, education, and other social programs. But you've made a very important point. What is it like to live under the brutalization of the blockade, right? I mean, like people on the outside, people live in the real world, right? And it's interesting that if you even look at it, quite often, many of these people on the ultra left will look at, for example, the early years of the Soviet Union, at least, as being, this example of socialist development and so forth. But what did Lenin do under NEP? Okay, he made concessions because of the brutal conditions that had emerged and developed on the basis of the Civil War and the intervention in Soviet Union and so forth. So Cuba lives in the real world, but is attempting in many ways, as they say, to continue to construct socialism under these adverse conditions to ensure that the surplus that's produced in the society, whether it's through the state enterprises, right, or whether it's through these private activities, right, is appropriated by the state and then distributed to benefit the rest of the society, right? But people have these fantasy visions, right? What is Cuba supposed to do? It's facing imperial aggression, right? And yet it's been able, right, okay, to build what was universally recognized, even though it's under assault, right, a healthcare system, right, that is a model for the rest of the global south, an education system and so forth, right? And in these extreme circumstances, it's trying to preserve it, and it's trying to, in a time of crisis, to ensure that the pain of this crisis is equally and equitably distributed across the society. That's not an ideal world, right, and so on, right? So it's very interesting.
I completely agree. The present measures that we see are so attentive to necessity. And for the same reason that we're seeing the postponement, again, of the 9th Congress of the Communist Party over the course of a national emergency, and the new economic models presented as a response to that national emergency as well. I think it's packaged as the government directives to confront an acute fuel shortage. All of this seems very clear-minded. And what we see over the course of this economic but also social program is an attempt to diversify foreign income. And again, this is what we're demanding when we call for Mexico or Russia or China or, God forbid, Canada to break the blockade. And then we trust Cuba's ability to direct that income meaningfully, as we know that they can. So if you read the report and you get into the nitty-gritty of this new program, it's very clear as to its indicators of growth and sustainable diversification and so on. But there's an epigram from Fidel that I want to read that I think is important, corresponding to General Objective 4, which is the one about modernizing the business system and so on. And it says, no company can close its doors without a fight. We must reinvent ourselves, diversify, seek alternatives, but not surrender. And it would be a terrible mistake to see anything like surrender in this document.
Yeah. And I think that's a powerful epigram, right? And it demonstrates what the Cubans wish to accomplish and achieve in very difficult circumstances. This is a national emergency, and I think people should also aware that in Cuba there are debates on how to solve this crisis, how to approach it, right? There are debates on how to construct socialism, right? In sort of general, but also under these very specific circumstances, right? And basically there is this commitment. And there are people who believe in this kind of fantasy, magical thinking kind of socialism that exists. That's perfect, right? We live in the real world. We live with a country. Cubans live in a country under imperial assault. Okay, a country seeking to destroy its very right to exist, to reduce it simply to be an appendage of the United States, which it was from 1898 until the triumph of the revolution. So I think all of these things, when I see these critiques, right, I wonder what would these people do? And they sit in their armchairs without realizing that the Cuban people, you have to feed people, you have to ensure there's transport, you have to do all of these different things, right? And then you face this huge national emergency, unprecedented. What would happen in Canada if suddenly there was no fuel, right, or none of these things, right, that were available, right? What would have happened to Canada if the same situation had happened to Cuba, had happened to Canada? If 85% of its trade had suddenly collapsed, there would be chaos in this country. Yet Cubans have an ethos of social solidarity, which is empowered by a revolutionary state that is rooted in the people and so on, and in which people engage in vigorous debate about how to resolve the problems they face and how to construct a society of social justice and independence in a hostile world.
And an increasingly hostile world. Now, on one hand, we need to refute the idealism, the high-minded, singularly unhelpful idealism of people who refuse to understand the particular challenges facing a state under siege. And then, as you say, we should also very attentively observe and extol the miracle of the Cuban experiment, which has set out to meaningfully improve the lives of millions of people. It's a remarkable example under duress of a 6-decade blockade.
So at the end of the day, perhaps we could say that nobody can predict the future. None of us are prognosticators, right? The world is a very dangerous place. It's incredibly frightening, right? Unsettling, right? And we've seen so much changes, right, and shifts. So no one can predict the future, but what we can guarantee is the Cuban people will continue to demonstrate their ingenuity, their tenacity, and will fight to defend their revolutionary project, right? And and that's all we can ask. We're all in the trenches of the struggle, and in a place like Canada, it behoves us to basically, ensure that that the Canadian government does not adopt an openly aggressive policy towards Cuba, and to push them to provide as much assistance to Cuba up to oil as they can, and almost immediately that they can do. And in fact, there was a poll just done by Global News. It was that 51% of Canadians believe that Canada should provide as much assistance to Cuba as is needed, and whatever the United States does, right? Okay, and also understanding that given the global geopolitical context, as you and us and many other people have said, defending Cuba is a concrete contribution to defending Canadian sovereignty, because the attack on any country is an attack on all of us. And more importantly, Cuba represents hope. It represents the idea that a project of social justice and human dignity is possible in this world, right? That there is an alternative to the austerity that's been imposed here in Canada by Carney, that's been imposed in the United States in vicious ways and brutal ways by the Trump regime, and we see unfolding across the world. It's possible to provide for the citizens, right? To put people above, capital accumulation.
Primero aquel, lleno de emoción y ruido, alguien dijo conmovido y feliz, gracias Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel. Y el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel.